I'm Marcus Thompson, 34. A construction foreman who never thought I'd be fighting for my children in a courtroom. For 3 years, my ex-wife Rachel had made it clear I was the weekend dad, the fun parent who couldn't handle real responsibility. You could never manage bedtime routines, school pickups, or doctor appointments, she'd say with that dismissive laugh. I believed her. After all, she was the one with the college degree, the organized planner, the natural parent. But when I discovered what was really happening in that house, the neglect, the boyfriends cycling through, the lies she told the school about me, everything changed. What started as supervised visits became something neither of us expected. The woman who claimed I couldn't handle 2 kids for a weekend was about to learn what a real father looks like when he stops doubting himself. The alarm clock screamed at 4:30 a.m., same as every weekday for the past 8 years. I'd roll out of bed in my cramped studio apartment, muscle memory guiding me through the motions, shower, coffee, work clothes. Out the door by 5:15. The construction site waited for no one, and neither did the crew I supervised. But Friday mornings were different. Friday mornings carried the weight of anticipation, and dread rolled into one suffocating ball in my chest. Every other Friday got to be a real father for exactly 60 hours. The small backpacks, sitting by Rachel's front door, always told me everything I needed to know about my children's week. Emma's pink unicorn backpack would be hastily stuffed, clothes wrinkled and mismatched. Jake's superhero bag usually had a broken zipper or torn strap that hadn't been there the previous Sunday. These weren't the carefully organized overnight bags of children who felt secure and loved. They were grab bags thrown together by someone who couldn't wait to hand over responsibility. "They're ready," Rachel would announce through the barely cracked door, never quite meeting my eyes. She'd perfected the art of making me feel like an inconvenience, a disruption to her real life. The kids would shuffle past her, quiet and tentative, as if they weren't sure they were allowed to be excited about seeing their father. Emma, 8 years old with Rachel's dark hair, but my stubborn chin, would give me these careful hugs, the kind that spoke of a child who'd learned not to expect too much. Jake, 6 and all energy when he felt safe, would sometimes forget himself and launch into my arms with genuine enthusiasm. But I could always see the moment he remembered the rules, the way his face would close off slightly, like he was protecting himself from disappointment. "Be good for your father," Rachel would say, as if being good for me was some extraordinary effort they'd have to make. As if I was the unreliable one, the parent who couldn't be trusted with their well-being. The drive to my apartment was quiet, not the comfortable quiet of a family at peace, but the tentative silence of children who weren't sure what version of their father they'd get this weekend. Would I be the fun dad who took them for ice cream and let them stay up late? Or would I be overwhelmed, frustrated, proving Rachel right about my inability to handle real parenting? I'd spent the first year of our divorce trying to be the perfect weekend dad. Pinterest-worthy activities, educational outings, healthy meals I'd researched and planned all week. But perfection is exhausting, and children don't need perfect, they need present. They need a father who can handle their meltdowns without falling apart, who knows how they like their cereal, who remembers that Emma hates loud noises, and Jake needs exactly 3 bedtime stories. The truth was, I was learning to be their father all over again. During our marriage, I'd been the provider, the one who worked long hours so Rachel could stay home with the babies. I'd missed first steps, first words, the 1,000 small moments that teach you who your children really are. The divorce forced me to confront how much of their daily lives I'd been absent from, even when I lived in the same house. "Dad, can we have pancakes?" Emma would ask every Friday night, and I'd realize I didn't know if she actually liked pancakes, or if she was just asking for something she thought would make me happy. These were the gaps in my knowledge that made me question everything Rachel said about my inadequacy as a father. But there were Monsa's beautiful, precious moments. The walls would come down. Saturday mornings when Jake would crawl into my bed and tell me about his dreams. Sunday afternoons when Emma would let me braid her hair, trusting me with the tangles and the tears when I pulled too hard. These glimpses of who we could be together as a family gave me hope, even as they broke my heart. The hardest part was Sunday evenings. The careful ritual of packing their bags, checking that they had everything, knowing I wouldn't see them again for 2 weeks. The way their faces would change as we got closer to Rachel's house, joy fading into resignation. They'd hug me goodbye, with the same careful restraint they'd shown on Friday, and I'd watch them walk back into a life I had no control over, no insight into. "See you in 2 weeks, buddy," I'd tell Jake, ruffling his hair. "Love you, princess," I'd whisper to Emma, hoping she understood that my love for her wasn't conditional on court schedules or custody agreements. Rachel would appear at the door with that same dismissive look, as if she was doing me a favor by allowing me these scraps of time with my own children. "How did they behave?" she'd ask, as if expecting a report on their misconduct, as if their behavior with me was somehow a reflection of her parenting, another metric by which to judge my inadequacy. I'd drive home in silence, my empty apartment waiting to remind me of everything I'd lost. The single coffee cup in the sink, the silence that pressed in from all sides, the photos on my nightstand that captured moments I could only access every other weekend. This was my life now, a construction foreman who built other people's homes. during the week and played father on weekends, always wondering if I was enough, always afraid I wasn't. Rachel Morrison. She'd dropped my last name the moment the ink dried on our divorce papers. Was everything I wasn't. College educated, articulate, the kind of woman who knew how to navigate parent-teacher conferences and school fundraisers. Without breaking a sweat, she had a presence that commanded respect in rooms where my calloused hands and construction boots made me feel like an imposter. The school newsletter that came home in Emma's backpack each month was a testament to Rachel's involvement. Parent Volunteer Spotlight. Rachel Morrison appeared with clockwork regularity, highlighting her contributions to the book fair, her organization of the spring carnival, her tireless efforts with the PTA fundraising committee. Her photo smiled back from the glossy pages, perfectly styled hair, professional blouse, the image of maternal dedication. Your mother does so much for your school, I'd tell Emma, trying to hide the inadequacy that crept into my voice. How could I compete with someone who had the time, education, and social connections to be the perfect school parent? My contributions were limited to showing up for Emma's school play with sawdust still under my fingernails, sitting in the back row, feeling like everyone could see exactly what I was, a weekend father trying to play in a league above his station. Rachel had made it clear from the beginning that she was the real parent. During our custody mediation, she'd presented color-coded calendars showing the children's schedules, detailed meal plans, educational enrichment activities. Her attorney had laid out her case with surgical precision. Stable home environment, consistent caregiving demonstrated commitment to the children's development. I'd sat there with my court-appointed lawyer, watching her build an airtight argument for why the children belonged primarily with her. Mr. Thompson works 60-hour weeks in construction, her attorney had stated, as if my job was evidence of my unsuitability as a father. Miss Morrison has structured her career around the children's needs. She's available for school pickup, medical appointments, and provides educational support that Mr. Thompson, given his work schedule and background, simply cannot match. I'd wanted to argue, to point out that my long hours were how I'd supported our family for years, that my background included growing up in a loving home with parents who'd never made me feel less than because they didn't have college degrees. But the truth was harder to swallow. Rachel was right about some things. I didn't know Emma's teacher's last name. I'd never been to a parent-teacher conference. I couldn't help with homework beyond basic math because I'd barely graduated high school myself. The parenting classes ordered by the court were a special kind of humiliation. 20-something social workers teaching me how to effectively communicate with my own children, how to establish healthy boundaries, how to provide emotional support during transition periods. I'd sit in those fluorescent lit classrooms, surrounded by other broken fathers, taking notes on topics that should have been instinctual. Children need consistency, the instructor would say, and I'd think about how my children's consistency came from Rachel's world, her house. Her rules, her version of stability. I was the variable, the disruption to their routine every other weekend. Rachel played her role perfectly. At school events, she was the concerned mother asking thoughtful questions about curriculum and social development. At custody exchanges, she was the long-suffering ex-wife, managing a difficult situation with grace. In court documents, she was the primary caregiver protecting the children's best interests from a father who lacks the skills and stability necessary for increased responsibility. But there were cracks in the perfect facade if you knew where to look. The way Emma flinched when Rachel raised her voice during pickup. How Jake would cling to me for the first hour of every visit, as if he'd been holding his breath for 2 weeks. The careful way both children talked about home, monitoring their words like they'd learned that the wrong phrase might cause problems. Mom's friend Steve came over for dinner, Emma mentioned once, then quickly added, but he left early. Mom said not to tell you about dinner. The innocent comment hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I wasn't supposed to pursue. I'd started paying attention to these small revelations, filing them away without really understanding why. The time Jake mentioned that Mom forgot to pick me up from after-school care, but then quickly changed the subject. Emma's teacher casually asking if everything was okay at home because Emma had been falling asleep in class. The pediatrician's office calling to confirm an appointment that Rachel had apparently missed. These weren't the actions of the perfect mother portrayed in court documents and school newsletters, but questioning Rachel's parenting felt dangerous, like challenging a system designed to keep me in my place. I was the weekend dad, the one who couldn't be trusted with school pickup or bedtime routines. What right did I have to question the woman everyone agreed was the better parent? The supervised visits ordered during our initial separation had been particularly humiliating. A court-appointed monitor would sit in my living room, taking notes on my interactions with Emma and Jake, evaluating my fitness as a father, like I was a dangerous stranger rather than the man who'd changed their diapers and rocked them to sleep. As babies, Mr. Thompson demonstrates appropriate engagement with the children, the monitor would write. Children appear comfortable and responsive to father's presence. Clinical observations of my relationship with my own kids, reduced to bullet points in a report that would determine my future access to them. Rachel had fought against unsupervised visits, claiming concern for the children's emotional well-being. Marcus has a temper, she'd told the court, referencing one argument we'd had during our marriage where I'd raised my voice. The children need protection from his instability. Never mind that her protection meant limiting their time with their father, or that her definition of my instability seemed to fluctuate based on what served her. Narrative. The truth was messier than Rachel's carefully constructed story. She wasn't the perfect mother she presented to the world, and I wasn't the inadequate father she painted me as. But in family court, perception carried more weight than reality, and Rachel had mastered the art of perception management. She knew which words to use, which concerns to raise, which professionals to charm. I was learning, slowly and painfully, that fighting for my children meant fighting an entire system that had already decided who deserved them more. It started with small things. Emma's math homework crumpled at the bottom of her backpack, tear stains blurring the pencil marks where she'd erased the same problem over and over. When I smoothed out the wrinkled paper, I could see her frustration. In every erased line, every pressed too hard calculation that had torn through to the other side. Did Mom help you with this? I asked gently, not wanting to make Emma feel worse about the obvious struggle. She shook her head, avoiding my eyes. She was busy. Steve was over, and they were watching a movie. The way she said it mattered, but careful made something twist in my stomach. 8-year-olds shouldn't have to navigate adult priorities, shouldn't have to compete with their mother's social life for homework help. Jake's changes were different, but equally troubling. My energetic 6-year-old had become clingy in a way that felt desperate rather than affectionate. He'd follow me from room to room during our weekends together, as if afraid I might disappear when he wasn't looking. Bedtime became a negotiation that could stretch for hours. I don't want to go to sleep, he'd whisper, tears making his eyes shine in the dim light of my bedroom. Can I sleep with you tonight? What's wrong with your bed, buddy? I'd ask, but he'd just shake his head and burrow deeper under my covers. The nightmares started around the same time. Jake waking up crying about monsters in his room, about being lost, about people leaving him behind. When I'd try to ask about what might be scaring him, he'd clam up with a wariness that broke my heart. The more time I spent with them, the more I noticed the gaps in their care. Emma's clothes were often too small or stained with something Rachel hadn't bothered to wash out. Jake's sneakers had holes that let in water, something I only discovered when he came home from school with soaked socks and a developing cough that Rachel dismissed as seasonal allergies. Mommy forgot to pack my lunch yesterday, Emma mentioned one Friday. The statement delivered with the same careful neutrality she used when talking about home. The lunch lady gave me a sandwich, but I had to promise to bring the money on Monday. I made a mental note to slip a 20 into Emma's backpack, knowing that asking Rachel directly about missed lunch money would result in another lecture about not undermining her parenting. But 8-year-olds shouldn't have to promise school administrators money their mother forgot to provide. They shouldn't have to navigate the embarrassment of being the kid who can't pay for lunch. The conversation that changed everything happened on a rainy Sunday afternoon in October. I'd been helping Jake build a fort out of couch cushions when Emma curled up next to me with a book, her small body fitting perfectly against my side. For a moment, it felt like the family we used to be: comfortable, connected, safe. Dad, Emma said quietly, her finger tracing the edges of her book's pages. Do you think Mommy loves us? The question hit me like a physical blow. I set down the pillow I'd been adjusting and looked at my daughter's serious face, trying to process what would make an 8th-year-old doubt her mother's love. Of course she loves you, princess. Why would you ask that? Emma shrugged, but I could see the real hurt underneath her casual gesture. She's always busy, and when Steve comes over, she tells us to go to our rooms so they can have adult time. Sometimes she forgets to make us dinner and we just eat cereal. Jake asked her for help with his homework last week, and she said she was too tired from work. Each detail felt like a small knife twisting in my chest. Rachel didn't work. That had been part of her argument for primary custody, that she was available for the children in ways my job wouldn't allow. So what was making her too tired to help our 6-year-old with homework? And who was this Steve character who rated more attention than our children's basic needs? Last week, Jake wet the bed and Mommy got really mad. Emma continued, her voice getting smaller. She said he was too old for that and made him wash his own sheets. He doesn't know how to work the washing machine, so I helped him. But the sheets were still wet when bedtime came, so he slept on the floor. I had to work to keep my voice steady. How often does Jake have accidents? A lot lately. Mommy says it's because he's being a baby, but I think he's scared. Sometimes when Steve comes over, they get loud, and Jake comes to my room. We hide under my covers until it gets quiet again. The picture Emma was painting destroyed every assumption I'd made about their life with Rachel. This wasn't the stable, nurturing environment described in court documents. These were children walking on eggshells, competing with their mother's boyfriend for attention, handling responsibilities that should have been managed by adults. Emma, I said carefully, has Steve ever been mean to you or Jake? She shook her head quickly, maybe too quickly. He just doesn't like it when we're loud. He says kids should be seen and not heard, like in the old days. Mommy laughs when he says that, but I don't think it's funny. A 6-year-old sleeping on the floor in wet pajamas. An 8-year-old taking care of her younger brother because their mother was too distracted by her boyfriend. Children told to stay out of sight. So, adults could have alone time in what was supposed to be their home. Dad, Jake appeared at my elbow, having abandoned the pillow fort. Can we stay here tonight? I like it better when it's just us. Looking at my children, really, seeing them, I realized I'd been blind to their reality. I'd been so focused on proving myself worthy of more time with them that I'd missed the signs that they needed more than weekend visits. They needed protection, advocacy, a father who would fight for them, instead of accepting the scraps of time the court had awarded. We'll figure something out, buddy, I promised. And for the first time since our divorce, I meant it. The weekend. Dad was about to become something Rachel hadn't counted, and a father who finally understood what his children needed and was willing to fight for it. The composition notebook cost $1.99 at the drugstore. A simple black and white speckled cover that would become the most important purchase I'd ever made. That Monday morning, after dropping Emma and Jake back at Rachel's house with heavy hearts and careful promises to see them soon, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote my first entry. October 15th. Emma asked if her mother loves them. Jake sleeping on floor due to wet sheets. Mother made him wash them himself, age 6. Children eating cereal for dinner when mother has adult time with boyfriend Steve. The words looked stark on the lined paper, almost unbelievable. But Emma's serious face and Jake's desperate clinging were burned into my memory, proof that something was seriously wrong in the home everyone assumed was better for my children. I'd never been much of a writer. Construction foremen don't typically document their days in journals. But my foreman training had taught me the importance of accurate records, of documenting incidents that might become important later. If I was going to challenge Rachel's version of reality, I needed evidence, not just instinct and emotion. The notebook went everywhere with me. Between job sites, I'd pull over and write down conversations from the weekend. Emma's casual mentions of missed meals, Jake's descriptions of being told to stay quiet, the way both children had started asking if they could live with me someday. Each entry painted a picture that contradicted everything the court believed about our situation. November 2nd, Jake had bruise on upper arm. Said he felt when asked for details, became evasive and changed subject. Emma immediately started talking about something else, like distraction. November 8th, Emma's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, made comment at school pickup. Emma seems tired lately, falling asleep during reading time. Asked if everything okay at home. November 15th, Jake cried during entire Sunday night, didn't want to go back to mom's house. Said Steve yells at us when mom's not looking. Asked for specifics. Jake shut down and wouldn't elaborate. The pattern was becoming clear, even to someone who'd never studied child psychology or family dynamics. My children weren't thriving in their stable environment, they were surviving it. The careful way they spoke about home, the way they seemed to hold their breath when I asked about their week, the desperate way they clung to our weekends together, these weren't signs of children who felt secure and loved. I started making phone calls during my lunch breaks, reaching out to anyone who might have insight into Emma and Jake's daily lives. The school secretary, Mrs. Patterson, had worked there for 15 years and knew how to read between the lines when parents struggled. The children seemed tense lately, she admitted, when I asked about their adjustment to the divorce. Emma's been coming to the office with stomach aches, and Jake's had several incidents where he's gotten upset during nothing dramatic, but they seem anxious in ways we don't usually see. What kind of incidents? Crying when his mom leaves? Asking when she's coming back? Needing extra reassurance from teachers? Sometimes children act out when there's instability at home, but Jake seems more scared than defiant. Scared. My 6-year-old son was scared, and I'd been too focused on being the perfect weekend dad to see it clearly. The supervised visits, the court-mandated parenting classes, Rachel's dismissive attitude, all of it had conditioned me to doubt my own observations. To assume that any problems were my fault for disrupting their routine. The pediatrician's office provided another piece of the puzzle. When I identified myself as Emma and Jake's father and asked about their recent appointments, the receptionist's tone shifted. "Oh, Mr. Thompson, we've been trying to reach Ms. Morrison about Jake's follow-up appointment for his persistent cough. He was supposed to come in 2 weeks ago, but she's rescheduled 3 times. And Emma missed her routine checkup last month. We sent several reminders." Medical neglect. The phrase echoed in my head as I added another entry to my notebook. Rachel had fought for primary custody partly based on her availability for the children's medical needs. But she was missing appointments and ignoring persistent health issues. Jake's cough had been going on for over a month. Something I'd noticed during our weekends, but assumed Rachel was handling. The most damaging conversation came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who lived next door to Rachel, approached me one evening as I was leaving after a custody exchange. I'd seen her tending her garden during pickups and drop-offs, but we'd never spoken beyond polite nods. "Excuse me," she said, her voice hesitant but determined. "You're the children's father?" "Yes, Emma and Jake." "Yes, ma'am. I hope you don't mind me saying, but I'm concerned about those little ones. There's a lot of activity at night. Men coming and going. Loud voices. The children are often outside in the yard late, like they're trying to get away from something. My blood ran cold. What kind of activity? Different men. Mostly, that Steve fellow is there several nights a week. But others too. Last weekend, there was quite a commotion shouting, something breaking. The children were sitting on the front steps in their pajamas at nearly midnight. I almost called the police, but they went back inside when things quieted down. She looked at me with the kind of directness that comes from years of watching neighborhoods change, of seeing families struggle behind closed doors. Those children deserve better than what they're getting. I know it's not my place, but someone needs to speak up for them. Mrs. Chin's observations confirmed my worst fears. The children weren't just being neglected, they were living in an unstable, possibly dangerous environment, while everyone assumed Rachel was the better parent. My careful documentation was building a case, but it was also building a terrible picture of what my children endured while I worked 60-hour weeks and accepted weekend visits like they were generous gifts, rather than my right as their father. That night, I read through every entry in my notebook, looking for patterns and connections I might have missed. The picture that emerged made me sick with rage and guilt. Emma and Jake needed protection, not weekend fun activities. They needed a father who would fight for them, not one who accepted court orders without question. The composition notebook had become more than documentation. It was my roadmap for taking back my children's lives. Mrs. Chen became my first ally in what I was beginning to understand would be a war for my children's well-being. 2 days after our conversation in her driveway, she knocked on my apartment door with a manila envelope tucked under her arm and the determined expression of someone who'd made a difficult decision. I wrote down everything I've observed over the past 6 months, she said, settling into my kitchen chair with the careful dignity of her 73 years. Dates, times, descriptions. I know what it's like to feel helpless when children are suffering. The handwritten pages she spread across my table were devastating in their detail. Mrs. Chen had been documenting Rachel's behavior with the methodical precision of someone who understood that children's lives hung in the balance. September 12th to 11th, 4:45 p.m. Children on front porch in pajamas while loud argument occurs inside. Male voice, not Steve shouting. Children appear scared. September 28th, Emma walking Jake to school. Both children appear unkempt. Emma carrying what looks like lunch money, counting coins on sidewalk. October 3rd, multiple cars in driveway. Party sounds until 2 a.m. No children visible, but bedroom lights on upstairs. The school bus driver has concerns too, Mrs. Chen continued, pulling out a small notepad. Betty Morrison, no relation to your ex-wife, has been driving this route for 12 years. She says Emma and Jake are often the last ones on the bus. In the morning, rushing out with uncombed hair and no breakfast. Sometimes Emma's carrying a granola bar she's trying to share with Jake. Betty Morrison had been willing to speak with Mrs. Chen but was nervous about getting involved officially. Drivers see everything, Mrs. Chen explained. She's watched these children change from happy kids to anxious ones who fight to sit in the front seat where she can keep an eye on them. The school secretary, Mrs. Patterson, had been more direct when Mrs. Chen approached her during a volunteer shift. I shouldn't be telling you this, she'd confided, but those children's emergency contact cards are concerning. Their mother lists 3 different phone numbers. And when we've tried to reach her for early dismissals or sick children, we often can't get through. Last week, Jake threw up in class, and we spent 2 hours trying to contact Ms. Morrison. Finally, reached her at a restaurant where she was having lunch with friends. The picture emerging from these conversations shattered any remaining illusions about Rachel's devoted motherhood. These weren't isolated incidents or misunderstandings, they were patterns of neglect from a woman who'd convinced everyone, including the court, that she was the superior parent. Emma's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had noticed changes too. When Mrs. Chen mentioned her concerns about the children during a parent volunteer session, Mrs. Rodriguez had looked troubled. Emma's academic performance has declined this semester, she'd admitted. She's often distracted, sometimes falls asleep during lessons, and her homework assignments are frequently incomplete or show signs of rushing. When I've tried to discuss this with her mother, Ms. Morrison seems more interested in scheduling convenience than addressing Emma's struggles. Mrs. Rodriguez had also observed social changes. Emma used to be outgoing, eager to participate in class discussions. Now she's withdrawn, rarely volunteers answers, and seems anxious during group activities. These are classic signs of stress. In children, the pediatrician's office provided another crucial piece of testimony. When Mrs. Chen had taken her grandson for a checkup, she'd overheard a conversation between nurses about missed appointments and unreturned calls regarding the Thompson children. The nurse was telling the doctor that they'd been trying to reach Emma and Jake's mother about follow-up care for Jake's persistent respiratory issues, Mrs. Chen reported. Apparently, she'd scheduled and canceled multiple appointments, and when they finally reached her, she seemed irritated about being asked to bring him in. But perhaps the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. Steve himself had become a problem. Visible to the neighborhood, Mrs. Chen had observed him screaming at the children for typical kid behavior, riding bikes too close to his car, talking too loudly while playing in the yard. being anywhere within his sight when he was trying to relax. Last Saturday afternoon, I watched him grab Jake by the arm and march him into the house for laughing too loudly while playing with a neighbor boy, Mrs. Chen reported, her voice tight with controlled anger. The way that little boy's face changed from happy to terrified in seconds, it reminded me of my own childhood with an angry stepfather. Mrs. Chen had lived through enough to recognize abuse when she saw it, and she wasn't going to stay silent while children suffered. But she was also savvy enough to understand that her observations alone wouldn't be enough to change a custody arrangement that favored their mother. You need professionals, she told me over coffee, her weathered hands folded around her mug. Teachers, doctors, people the court will listen to. I'm just a nosy neighbor, but Mrs. Rodriguez cares about Emma, and that pediatrician's office has documentation of missed appointments and ignored medical needs. She was right. But approaching these professionals felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. Once I started making official inquiries, Rachel would know I was building a case against her. The weekend visits that were my only connection to Emma and Jake could be at risk if she decided to fight back with false allegations or emergency custody motions. Those children are living in fear, Mrs. Chen said gently, reading the hesitation in my face. I've raised 4 children and helped raise 6 grandchildren. I know what healthy childhood looks like, and this isn't it. You're there for them isn't optional. That evening, I sat with my composition notebook and Mrs. Chen's detailed observations, trying to build the courage to take the next step. The evidence was overwhelming, but evidence meant nothing without someone willing to act on it. My children were depending on me to be braver than I felt, stronger than I'd proven myself to be during 2 years of accepting weekend visits is enough. The father they needed was one who would risk everything to protect them, not one who played it safe to preserve limited access. It was time to stop being the weekend dad and start being the advocate Emma and Jake deserved. The family law book was thick enough to stop a door. Its spine cracked from previous owners who'd fought their own battles through the legal system. I'd bought it used from a law student's garage sale for $15 money I couldn't really afford but couldn't afford not to spend. If I was going to challenge Rachel's custody, I needed to understand the system that had already ruled against me once. The attorney consultation had been a brutal wake-up call. David Hensley, a family law specialist with 20 years of experience, had listened to my concerns with the practiced patience of someone who'd heard similar stories countless times. His office was everything. Mine wasn't expensive furniture, diplomas covering the walls, the kind of polished professionalism that commanded respect in courtrooms. Mr. Thompson, he'd said after reviewing my documentation, what you're describing is concerning, but family courts are reluctant to modify custody arrangements without compelling evidence of immediate danger. The burden of proof is on you too. Demonstrate that the current arrangement is not in the children's best interests. The retainer fee was $5,000, with additional costs that could easily reach $15,000 or more if the case went to trial. For a construction foreman supporting 2 households and paying child support, those numbers might as well have been $50,000. I made decent money, but Rachel's alimony and child support payments left me with barely enough to cover my own rent and groceries. I can't afford a long court battle, I'd admitted, hating how the words made me sound like I was choosing money over my children. Hensley had nodded with the weary understanding of someone who'd seen too many good parents priced out of fighting for their kids. Family law favors those with resources, unfortunately, but there are alternatives. You can represent yourself pro se representation. It's challenging, but possible with enough preparation. That's how I'd ended up spending my evenings hunched over legal texts, trying to decode a system designed for lawyers. The book became my Bible, its pages marked with sticky notes and highlighted passages about burden of proof, best interests, standards, and modification requirements. A material change in circumstances that affects the welfare of the child must be demonstrated. I read aloud to my empty apartment, practicing the language I'd need to use in court. The legal terminology felt foreign in my mouth, but I was determined to learn it well enough to advocate for Emma and Jake. The children's guardian ad litem would be a crucial court-appointed advocate whose job was to investigate and recommend what was truly best for Emma and Jake, independent of what either Rachel or I wanted. But guardians ad litem were overworked, carrying caseloads that made thorough investigations difficult. I needed to make sure they had access to all the evidence I'd gathered. Mrs. Patterson at the school had agreed to speak officially about her observations, but only if subpoenaed. I've seen too many custody battles turn ugly, she'd explained. I need the protection of a court order to discuss specific children's situations. Dr. Martinez at the pediatrician's office had been more forthcoming. When I'd identified myself as Emma and Jake's father and expressed concerns about missed appointments, she'd been surprisingly candid. I've been trying to discuss Jake's recurring respiratory issues with his mother for months, she'd said. He needs to see a pulmonologist, but Ms. Morrison keeps canceling appointments and hasn't returned my calls about the referral. This isn't typical of engaged parents. The medical records would be powerful evidence, but obtaining them required navigating privacy laws and formal requests that could take weeks to process. Every day that passed was another day my children lived in an environment that wasn't safe for them. The psychological evaluation process was perhaps the most daunting aspect of the legal challenge. Both Rachel and I would undergo extensive interviews, home visits, and psychological testing. Our parenting abilities would be dissected by strangers who would make recommendations that could determine our children's futures. The evaluator will look at stability, emotional availability, and the children's expressed preferences, Hensley had explained, but they'll also consider practical factors: income, housing, work schedules. You'll need to demonstrate that you can provide better care than their current situation, not just different care. That meant proving I could handle school pickup, doctor's appointments, and daily parenting responsibilities while maintaining full-time employment. It meant showing that my modest apartment could provide a better environment than Rachel's house. With its perfect facade and hidden chaos, the financial reality was stark. Even representing myself, the court costs, evaluation fees, and lost wages from time off work would strain my budget to the breaking point. Rachel had family money and professional connections, resources I couldn't match. But what I had was something she'd lost: genuine concern for our children's well-being. The book taught me about emergency, custody modification situations where children were in immediate danger and couldn't wait for lengthy court proceedings. But proving immediate danger required evidence of abuse or severe neglect, a higher standard than the emotional neglect and instability I'd documented. Late at night, reading about termination of parental rights and kinship care options, I realized how precarious my children's situation really was. If Rachel's behavior continued to deteriorate, they could end up in foster care rather than with me. The system was designed to preserve parental rights, even when those rights weren't being exercised responsibly. The most important lesson from my legal research was that good intentions weren't enough. I needed documentation, witnesses, professional testimony, and a clear plan for how I could provide better care. The weekend dad who'd accepted limited access out of fear and guilt had to become an advocate willing to risk everything. The law book closed with a soft thud, its lessons absorbed but its challenges still ahead. Tomorrow, I would file my motion for custody modification and begin the process of proving that love alone wasn't enough. I had to be willing to fight for it in a system that would test every aspect of my fitness as a father. Jake's drawing was supposed to be about my family, a standard second-grade assignment that usually resulted in stick figures holding hands under rainbow skies. Instead, my 6-year-old son had created something that made his teacher immediately call the school counselor for consultation. The paper was wrinkled when Emma pulled it from Jake's backpack, handled with the careful reverence children reserve for things that feel important but scary. Jake got in trouble for this at school, she explained quietly, but he said it was true, so he couldn't change it. The drawing showed a house with windows that looked like angry eyes. Stick figures stood in different rooms, a small figure, labeled Jake, cowering in a corner, while larger figures filled the center space. Dark scribbles covered most of the sky, and the family dog hood never appeared in any of Jake's previous artwork was hiding under what appeared to be a table. "Tell me about your picture, buddy," I said, sitting beside Jake on my couch and trying to keep my voice casual. Art therapy wasn't my expertise, but I'd learned enough from the parenting classes to know that children often revealed truth through their drawings that they couldn't express in words. "That's our house," Jake said matter-of-factly, pointing to the angry-eyed structure, "and that's me in my room when Steve gets loud. Emma's supposed to be there too, but sometimes she sneaks out to check on Mom." He pointed to a figure in the center of the drawing larger than the others, with dark scribbles around it. "That's Steve when he's mad. He gets really big when he yells. And that's Mommy," a smaller figure standing close to the Steve character, trying to make him not mad anymore. The innocence in Jake's voice, as he described a scene of domestic chaos, broke something in my chest. This wasn't childhood imagination, this was a 6-year-old's documentary of his daily reality, rendered in crayon with the stark honesty that adults spend years learning to hide. "What makes Steve mad?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Lots of stuff. When we're too loud, when we leave toys out, when we ask Mom for things when he's there. Yesterday he got mad because I couldn't find my shoes fast enough for school. He said I was making him late for work, but he doesn't even take us to school." Emma had been quietly coloring at the other end of the couch, but she looked up at Jake's words. "You're not supposed to tell Dad about Steve getting mad," she reminded him, but without the conviction of someone who believed the rule was right. "Why not?" I asked Emma gently. "What happens if you tell me about Steve?" She shrugged, but I could see the conflict in her 8-year-old features. "Mom says it makes you worry, and worried dads cause problems. She says Steve is nice to us, and if we tell you different stories, you might try to take us away from Mom." The manipulation was breathtaking in its simplicity. Rachel had trained our children to protect her relationship with Steve by censoring their own experiences, teaching them that their father's concern was a threat to their family's stability rather than evidence of his love. "Princess, I want you to always tell me the truth about how you're feeling and what's happening in your life," I said carefully. "A dad's job is to worry about his kids, that's not a bad thing, and you never have to protect me from the truth." Jake's Drawing had captured other details that spoke to the chaos in Rachel's house. The refrigerator in the kitchen was empty, drawn with deliberate white space where food should be. The children's bedrooms showed clothes scattered on the floor and beds that looked unmade. Most tellingly, there were no pictures on the walls. No family photos or children's artwork displayed the kind of personal touches that make a house feel like a home. Jake, when you made this picture, were you sad or scared or just drawing what you see? He considered the question with the seriousness that childhood reserves for important adult inquiries. Both, I think. Mrs. Williams, that's my teacher, she said. Our houses should show happy families, but I don't know how to draw happy when it's loud and scary. The school counselor, Mrs. Williams, had told Emma, wanted to meet with Rachel about Jake's artwork. But when the appointment time came, Rachel had sent Steve instead, claiming she was sick. Steve had explained that Jake was going through a phase and that the drawing reflected his imagination rather than reality. Steve told my teacher that I watch too much TV and that's why I draw scary pictures. Jake continued. But we don't really watch TV because Steve doesn't like kid shows. He says they're stupid and loud. Every detail painted a picture of children walking on eggshells, managing their behavior around an adult who saw them as inconveniences rather than family members. The emotional environment Jake had captured in his drawing, fear, chaos, the antithesis of the stable home the court believed Rachel provided. Emma, do you ever draw pictures about your feelings? I asked, wondering if she had similar artistic revelations hidden in her school folders. She nodded and pulled out a folder. From her backpack, the drawings she showed me were different from Jake's, more sophisticated but equally revealing. Families where the children stood far away from the adults. Houses with locks on all the doors. Self-portraits where Emma looked tiny compared to the world around her. I don't show these to my teacher, Emma explained. She might ask questions that I don't know how to answer without getting Mom in trouble. At 8 years old, Emma had learned to self-censor her artistic expression to protect her mother's reputation. She'd internalized the responsibility for maintaining Rachel's facade, understanding that her truth could threaten the adult's version of reality. Can I keep Jake's drawing? I asked, though I already knew it would join the evidence in my composition notebook, and maybe some of yours too. Emma, I'd like to understand better what your lives are like when I'm not there. Both children nodded solemnly, as if they'd been waiting for someone to finally ask them to tell their truth. Jake's crayon documentation of fear and chaos, Emma's carefully hidden portraits of isolation, these weren't just childhood artwork. They were testimony from witnesses too young to understand the legal system but old enough to know when their world wasn't safe. The drawings would speak louder than any adults. Testimony about what my children experienced daily in the home, everyone assumed was better for them. The police report arrived via certified mail on a Tuesday morning that started like any other but ended with my world tilted off its axis. Rachel Morrison had filed charges alleging that I had made threatening statements during our last custody exchange and that she feared for her safety and the children's well-being. According to the report, I had aggressively confronted Rachel about her parenting, made veiled threats about taking the children away, and exhibited erratic behavior, consistent with someone planning dangerous actions. The responding officer had recommended that Rachel document any future interactions and consider requesting a restraining order if my harassment continued. None of it was true, but truth seemed less relevant than timing. I'd filed my motion for custody modification just 5 days earlier, and Rachel's response was swift and calculated. If she could paint me as unstable, dangerous, or obsessed, it would undermine everything I'd worked to build. The threatening statements had been my attempt to address Jake's recurring nightmares and Emma's anxiety about going home. I'd asked Rachel directly about Steve's role in the children's lives and whether she felt their current living situation was meeting their emotional needs. Apparently, asking questions about my children's well-being constituted harassment in Rachel's interpretation. The erratic behavior described in the report was even more damaging. According to Rachel's statement, I had been obsessively documenting interactions and questioning the children inappropriately about their home life. She claimed that Emma had told her I was asking her to spy on Mommy, and that Jake had become afraid of making his father angry by not having good stories to tell. Reading Rachel's version of events was like looking at my life through a funhouse. Every action distorted, every motivation twisted to serve her narrative. My documentation of concerning incidents became obsessive surveillance. My questions about the children's well-being became inappropriate interrogation. My love for Emma and Jake became something possessive and threatening. The officer who'd taken the report, Sergeant Martinez, had included a note recommending that I seek counseling for anger management and accept the current custody arrangement, rather than pursuing disruptive legal action. He'd also suggested that continued interference with the children's routine could result in supervised visits being reinstated. My hands shook as I read that final recommendation. 2 years of fighting for unsupervised time with my own children, months of careful documentation and evidence gathering, the slow rebuilding of my relationship with Emma and Jake, all of it threatened by Rachel's preemptive strike against my custody petition. but Rachel had made a mistake in her rush to discredit me. The date on her police report was wrong. She'd claimed our threatening conversation had occurred on a Sunday when I'd actually been at a work site, something my timesheet and coworkers could verify. Her description of events also contradicted text messages she'd sent me that same day, casual communications about pickup times and the children's school schedules. More importantly, Rachel's allegations revealed her awareness of my investigation. She wouldn't have filed false charges unless she felt genuinely threatened by what I might discover or prove in court. Innocent parents don't typically resort to police reports. When their ex-spouses ask questions about child welfare, I called David Hensley's office immediately, knowing that his consultation fee would stretch my budget, but understanding that Rachel's escalation required professional guidance. His paralegal squeezed me in for an emergency appointment that afternoon. "This is actually good news," Hensley said, after reviewing the police report, which seemed like an insane assessment of accusations that could destroy my case. "She's overplayed her hand. False police reports are serious business, and we can prove this one is false." He explained that Rachel's response, pattern immediate escalation to law enforcement, exaggerated claims, attempts to shut down my investigation was typical of parents who had something to hide. Confident parents with nothing to fear don't usually file police reports about standard custody discussions, but the immediate challenge was damage control. Rachel had undoubtedly shared her police report with the children's guardian ad litem, the court-appointed advocate who would investigate our family situation. First impressions mattered enormously in custody cases, and Rachel had ensured that my first impression would be filtered through allegations of threatening behavior. "We need affidavits from everyone who can contradict her timeline and characterization of events," Hensley advised. "Coworkers who can verify your whereabouts, friends who can speak to your character, anyone who's observed your interactions with the children." My foreman, Tony Ramirez, had worked with me for 6 years and had seen me struggle through the divorce and custody battles. When I explained the situation, his response was immediate and fierce. "That's complete bullshit, Marcus. You're one of the most level-headed guys I know, and everyone here has seen how much you love those kids. I'll write whatever statement you need." The crew members who'd covered my shifts when I had custody exchanges were equally supportive. These were men who understood work ethic, responsibility, and what it meant to fight for family. They'd watched me leave job sites early to pick up sick children, seen me practice bedtime stories during lunch breaks, witnessed my dedication to being the father Emma and Jake deserved. Mrs. Chen, my neighbor, ally, was particularly valuable as a witness. She'd observed multiple custody exchanges and had never seen anything resembling the aggressive behavior Rachel described. Her statement would carry weight because she was neutral, a disinterested third party, with no motivation to lie for either parent. "I've watched Mr. Thompson with his children many times," she wrote in her careful handwriting. "He's patient, gentle, and clearly devoted to their well-being. The behavior described in this police report is completely inconsistent with everything I've observed over the past 2 years." But the most powerful response came from an unexpected source. Emma's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, called me directly after, apparently hearing about the police report through school district channels. "Mr. Thompson, I feel I need to share some concerns about Emma's well-being that might be relevant to your custody situation," she said carefully. "I can't get involved in legal disputes, but I can speak to what I observe in my classroom." Mrs. Rodriguez had documented a pattern of declining academic performance, increased anxiety, and concerning statements Emma had made about her home life. "Children don't typically experience this level of stress in stable, nurturing environments," she explained. "Whatever's happening at home is affecting Emma's ability to function at school." Rachel's police report had been intended to stop my investigation and discredit my concerns about the children's welfare. Instead, it had prompted people who'd been quietly worried to step forward with support and observations that strengthened my case. The false accusations revealed more about Rachel's state of mind than mine, and that revelation would prove crucial in the battles ahead. The medical records arrived in a thick manila envelope that felt heavier than its physical weight suggested. 3 years of documented appointments, missed checkups, and ignored recommendations painted a picture of maternal neglect that was impossible to dismiss or explain away. Dr. Martinez had been thorough in her documentation, and her notes revealed a pattern that supported every concern I'd raised about Rachel's care of Emma and Jake. The missed appointments were just the beginning. The real story was in the details of visits that did occur and the follow-up care that never happened. Jake's respiratory issues, which I'd noticed during our weekend visits, had been a concern for Dr. Martinez since early spring. Her notes from March indicated that Jake needed to see a pulmonologist for recurring bronchitis that wasn't responding to standard treatment. The referral had been made, an appointment scheduled, but the specialized consultation had never occurred. Mother rescheduled pulmonary consult 3 times, citing scheduling conflicts. Attempted phone follow-up unsuccessful. Patient continues to present with persistent cough and wheezing. Recommend immediate specialist evaluation. Emma's records were equally troubling. A routine hearing test had revealed potential issues that required follow-up with an audiologist. The recommendation had been made in September, but no follow-up appointment had been scheduled. Dr. Martinez's notes indicated multiple attempts to contact Rachel about this essential screening, attempted to reach mother regarding Emma's hearing evaluation, left 3 voicemails over 2 weeks, concerned about potential impact on academic performance if hearing loss goes untreated. The vaccination records showed another disturbing pattern. Both children were behind on required immunizations, not because of parental choice or medical contraindications, but because Rachel simply hadn't brought them in for scheduled appointments. The school had sent multiple notices about compliance, deadlines that had been ignored, but perhaps most damaging were Dr. Martinez's behavioral observations during visits that did occur. Her notes documented children who appeared anxious, unkempt, and reluctant to discuss their home environment. Jake, extremely clingy during visit, did not want to separate from mother for examination. When asked about activities at home, became quiet and looked to mother before answering. Mother appeared impatient with child's questions and examination process. Emma arrived for a sick visit with untreated head lice infestation that appears to have been present for several days. Mother seemed unaware of condition despite obvious symptoms. Discussed treatment protocol, but mother expressed frustration about additional expenses and complications. The head lice incident was particularly revealing. Emma had been suffering from an easily treatable condition while Rachel remained oblivious or unconcerned. The infection had been severe enough to require prescription medication, but the follow-up appointment to ensure treatment success had been canceled and never rescheduled. Dr. Martinez's notes also documented conversations about the children's emotional well-being that provided professional validation for my concerns. Jake's sleeping difficulties, Emma's complaints of stomach aches with no medical cause, both children's anxiety about medical procedures. These were indicators of stress that went beyond normal childhood fears. Jake reports frequent nightmares and difficulty sleeping. Mother attributes this to overactive imagination, but child appears genuinely distressed when discussing bedtime routines. Recommend consultation with child psychologist if symptoms persist. The psychological consultation had never been pursued. Rachel had dismissed Dr. Martinez's recommendation as unnecessary, claiming that Jake would grow out of his sleep problems without professional intervention. Emma's stomach aches had been attributed to everything from diet to growth spurts, but Dr. Martinez's notes suggested a different explanation. Emma continues to present with psychosomatic complaints, stomach pain with no physical cause, headaches, general malaise. Symptoms appear to correlate with stress rather than illness. Mother resistant to discussing potential emotional triggers. The school health records provided additional documentation of Rachel's inattention to the children's medical needs. The school nurse had contacted home multiple times about incidents requiring parental notification, playground injuries that needed monitoring, fever that required pickup, medication that needed administering, but had frequently been unable to reach Rachel during school hours. Attempted to contact mother regarding Jake's playground fall and possible concussion symptoms. Phone calls to all listed numbers unsuccessful. Emergency contact, grandmother retrieves child after 3-hour delay. The emergency contact situation was revealing in itself. Rachel had listed her mother as backup, but the records showed that grandmother, Morrison, had been called repeatedly when Rachel was unreachable. For a woman who'd argued that her availability was superior to my work schedule, Rachel was remarkably difficult to contact during school hours. The dental records told a similar story of neglect and missed care. Both children had cavities that had gone untreated for months, routine cleanings that had been skipped, and orthodontic consultations that had been recommended but never scheduled. Emma, in particular, needed dental work that was becoming more complex due to delayed treatment. But the most powerful piece of medical evidence came from an unexpected source. The children's school required physical exams had been conducted by a different doctor. When Dr. Martinez wasn't available for Rachel's preferred appointment time, Dr. Sarah Chun, Mrs. Chun's daughter-in-law, as it turned out, had documented observations that aligned perfectly with my concerns. Both children appear undernourished and show signs of inadequate supervision. Emma reported eating cereal for dinner lots of times and mentioned that mom forgets to go grocery shopping. Jake exhibited signs of anxiety during examination and made repeated references to loud noises and scary situations at home. Dr. Chen had been trained to recognize signs of neglect and abuse, and her clinical observations provided professional validation for what neighbors, teachers, and I had noticed about Emma and Jake's declining well-being. The medical records created an undeniable timeline of deteriorating care under Rachel's primary custody. These weren't subjective observations or emotional interpretations, they were objective, professional assessments from healthcare providers who had no stake in our custody dispute. Rachel had portrayed herself as the devoted mother who prioritized the children's health and well-being, but the documentation revealed a parent who was negligent, unresponsive, and more concerned with her own convenience than her children's medical needs. The envelope full of records would become the cornerstone of my custody case. proof that Emma and Jake's basic needs weren't being met in the home everyone assumed was better for them. Dr. Susan Walsh arrived at my apartment on a crisp December morning with a briefcase full of forms and the kind of professional demeanor that could determine my children's future. As the court-appointed custody evaluator, she held more power over Emma and Jake's lives than any judge, lawyer, or parent. Her recommendations would likely become the court's final decision. I'll be conducting home visits with both parents, interviewing the children separately, and reviewing all documentation related to this case, she explained, settling into my kitchen chair with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd evaluated hundreds of families. My job is to determine what custody arrangement serves the children's best interests, not what either parent wants. Her first impression of my apartment was crucial, and I'd spent weeks preparing for this moment. Every surface was clean, child-proofing was obvious and thorough, and the children's bedrooms small but carefully organized, evidence of a father who'd thought seriously about their daily needs. Emma's artwork covered one wall. Jake's books were organized by reading level, and both rooms had nightlights and the kind of comfort items that help anxious children feel secure. Tell me about your typical day with Emma and Jake, Dr. Walsh requested, her pen poised over a detailed evaluation form. Start to finish, what does parenting look like in your household? I'd rehearsed this conversation countless times, but the reality of describing my love for my children to a stranger felt surreal. Mornings start with breakfast. Together, Emma likes her toast cut diagonally. Jake prefers pancakes shaped like animals. We talk about their plans for the day, any worries they might have. Sometimes they tell me about their dreams. Dr. Walsh took notes as I described our routines. Homework help at the kitchen table where I could provide attention without hovering. Dinner conversations that included both children equally. Bedtime rituals that addressed Jake's anxiety and Emma's need for quiet time to decompress from her day. How do you handle discipline? She asked, a question that felt loaded with potential pitfalls. Consistency and natural consequences, I replied, sharing examples of how I'd managed Emma's reluctance to clean her room and Jake's tendency to interrupt conversations. The goal is helping them understand why rules exist, not just enforcing compliance through fear. Her questions probed deeper into my understanding of child development, my awareness of their individual personalities, and my plans for managing the practical challenges of primary custody. Could I handle school pickup with my work schedule? How would I address Emma's academic struggles and Jake's emotional needs? What was my support system for emergencies or sick days? Each answer required demonstrating that I'd moved beyond weekend dad activities to understanding the complex logistics of daily parenting. I'd already spoken with my foreman about flexible scheduling, researched after-school programs near my apartment, and identified backup childcare options for work emergencies. Your ex-wife has expressed concerns about your stability and decision-making, Dr. Walsh mentioned, referencing Rachel's police report without naming it directly. How do you respond to allegations that you've been obsessive about documenting the children's experiences? This was the moment Rachel's false accusations would either destroy my credibility or reveal her desperation. I pulled out my composition notebook, no longer ashamed of the careful records I'd kept. These aren't obsessive observations, they're documentation of concerning patterns that no one else seemed to notice, I explained, showing Dr. Walsh specific entries about missed meals, inappropriate supervision, and the children's increasing anxiety. I started keeping records because Emma asked if her mother loved them, and Jake was having nightmares about being abandoned. Dr. Walsh reviewed several pages of my documentation, her expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. This level of detail suggests genuine concern rather than harassment. Have you shared these observations with anyone else? I described Mrs. Chen's corroborating testimony, the school's increasing concerns, and Dr. Martinez's frustrated attempts to provide proper medical care. What Rachel had portrayed as obsessive surveillance was actually careful advocacy for children whose needs weren't being met. Tell me about the children's behavior during your visits, Dr. Walsh requested. Any changes in their demeanor, new anxieties, concerning statements? This was where Jake's drawing and Emma's careful self-censorship became powerful testimony. I showed Dr. Walsh the artwork that had prompted his teacher's concern, explained how both children had learned to edit their experiences to protect their mother's reputation. They shouldn't have to choose between honesty and loyalty, I said. 8-year-olds shouldn't feel responsible for managing adult emotions or hiding family problems. Dr. Walsh's visit to Rachel's house later that week revealed the stark differences in our approaches to parenting and home management. While I couldn't be present for that evaluation, the contrast would become clear in her final report. The psychological testing component was the most nerve-wracking aspect of the evaluation process. Dr. Walsh administered standardized assessments, designed to measure parental fitness, emotional stability, and child-rearing attitudes. Questions probed everything from my childhood experiences to my current stress management techniques. These tests aren't designed to find perfect parents, Dr. Walsh explained. They're meant to identify serious psychological issues that might interfere with parenting abilities. The goal is understanding how you handle stress, conflict, and the daily challenges of raising children. The children's interviews were conducted separately from both parents, giving Emma and Jake space to speak honestly about their experiences without fear of consequences. Dr. Walsh met with them at a neutral location, the family court's child interview room designed to be comfortable and non-threatening. I couldn't be present for those conversations, but I trusted that Emma and Jake would finally have the opportunity to tell their truth to someone with the authority to protect them. Their voices, filtered through Dr. Walsh's professional assessment, would carry more weight than any adult testimony. 2 weeks after the home visits, Dr. Walsh conducted follow-up interviews with both Rachel and me. Her questions for me focused on practical planning and future goals, how I would handle increased parenting responsibilities, what changes I would make to better serve the children's needs, and how I plan to co-parent with Rachel if custody arrangements changed. Primary custody isn't just about what's wrong with the current situation, she explained. I need to be confident that you can provide better care, not just different care. The children's stability and well-being depend on making the right recommendation. The waiting period after evaluations concluded was torture. Dr. Walsh's report would determine whether my children continued living in an unstable environment or finally received the protection and care they deserved. Weeks of evidence gathering, testimony from concerned professionals, and documentation of Rachel's neglect all depended on one person's professional judgment. When the call finally came, Dr. Walsh's voice was carefully neutral. Mr. Thompson, I've completed my evaluation and will be submitting my report to the court next week. I wanted to give you advance notice that my recommendations will likely surprise both parties. Her tone suggested that my fight for Emma and Jake had reached a turning point, but whether that meant victory or defeat remained to be seen. The social services report landed in my mailbox like a bomb with a delayed fuse. Child Protective Services had opened an investigation into Emma and Jake's living situation based on concerns raised during Dr. Walsh's custody evaluation. Teacher, a doctor, or perhaps Dr. Walsh herself had made a formal report that triggered the state's child protection protocols. The initial complaint outlined allegations that made my stomach clench with recognition: educational neglect, inadequate medical care, inappropriate supervision, and exposure to domestic instability. These weren't the vague concerns I'd been documenting in my composition notebook. They were official charges that could result in my children being removed from Rachel's custody entirely. I called David Hensley immediately, knowing that CPS involvement changed everything about our custody battle. This is actually what we've been working toward, he explained, though his tone suggested the complications that came with state intervention. CPS has resources and authority that family court doesn't. They can move quickly if children are in danger. The social worker assigned to Emma and Jake's case was Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran who'd seen every variation of family dysfunction imaginable. Her initial contact was professional but warm, the voice of someone who understood that good parents could find themselves entangled in bad situations. Mr. Thompson, I'll be conducting home visits with both parents and interviewing the children about their living situations, she explained during our first phone conversation. My job is to ensure Emma and Jake's safety, not to determine custody, but my findings will be shared with the family court handling your modification request. The CPS investigation moved with bureaucratic efficiency that made family courts seem glacial by comparison. Within days, Ms. Santos had reviewed medical records, interviewed school personnel, and conducted preliminary visits to both households. Her findings would either validate everything I'd been documenting or reveal that my concerns were the paranoid obsessions Rachel claimed them to be. The home visit to Rachel's house occurred on a Tuesday morning when Steve was supposedly at work and the children were at school. Ms. Santos arrived unannounced, a standard protocol designed to capture authentic living conditions rather than carefully staged presentations. What she found contradicted every assumption about Rachel's superior parenting. The house that looked perfect from the street was chaotic. Inside, dirty dishes piled in the sink, laundry covering furniture, children's toys scattered without any organizational system. The refrigerator contained mostly takeout containers and convenience foods, with little evidence of meal planning or nutritious family dinners. But the most damaging discoveries were in the children's bedrooms. Emma's room showed signs of someone much older than 8 trying to maintain adult-level organization: clothes sorted and folded with obsessive precision, school supplies arranged like a military barracks, artwork and personal items hidden away as if she'd learned that visible childhood was unwelcome. Jake's room told a different story of neglect and anxiety. His mattress was stained from repeated bedwetting incidents that hadn't been properly cleaned. Dirty clothes mixed with clean ones in piles that suggested no adult supervision of basic hygiene. Most telling were the hiding places Ms. Santos discovered: snacks hoarded under the bed, favorite toys hidden in closets, the behaviors of a child who'd learned that his possessions and comfort weren't secure. The children appear to be managing household responsibilities, typically handled by adults. Ms. Santos wrote in her preliminary report, Emma demonstrated knowledge of laundry procedures, meal preparation, and Jake's care routines that suggest inappropriate parentification. the term for children who become caretakers for their parents or siblings, was something I'd read about in my legal research but hadn't fully recognized in Emma's careful management of her brother's emotional needs and her own hyper-responsible behavior. The interview with Rachel revealed a parent who was defensive, dismissive of concerns, and surprisingly unaware of her children's daily experiences. When asked about Jake's bedwetting, Rachel blamed behavior and claimed that making him wash his own sheets taught responsibility. Emma's academic struggles were attributed to perfectionist tendencies, rather than the stress and sleep deprivation Ms. Santos had observed. Most damaging was Rachel's response to questions about Steve's role in the household. She minimized his presence and influence while simultaneously defending his right to establish boundaries with children who weren't his biological responsibility. The contradiction revealed a parent more concerned with protecting her relationship than acknowledging its impact on her children. Ms. Morrison seems unaware of or unconcerned about the emotional impact of her living situation on the children. Ms. Santos documented, when presented with specific examples of concerning behavior, she consistently deflected responsibility or minimized the significance of clear stress indicators. The children's interviews were conducted at school, in the familiar environment of the counselor's office where they felt safe enough to speak honestly. Emma's conversation with Ms. Santos revealed the careful emotional management she'd been doing for months. I try to keep Jake quiet when Steve is home because loud kids make him angry, Emma explained with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing normal household operations. Mom gets upset when Steve is upset, so it's easier if we just stay in our rooms. Jake's interview was more direct, the honesty of a 6-year-old who hadn't yet learned to edit his experiences for adult comfort. I don't like it when Steve yells at Mom, and I don't like it when Mom cries. Sometimes I hide in Emma's room, and she tells me stories until it gets quiet again. The medical neglect documentation was particularly damaging to Rachel's case. Ms. Santos reviewed the same records I'd obtained, but her professional perspective carried the authority of state child protection services. Jake's untreated respiratory issues, Emma's missed hearing evaluation, both children's delayed vaccinations. These weren't parent preferences, but failures to provide basic medical care. The pattern of missed appointments and ignored medical recommendations suggests either incapacity or unwillingness to prioritize children's health needs, Ms. Santos concluded. Both children require immediate medical attention that has been delayed for months, but perhaps the most powerful evidence came from the children's school records, which Ms. Santos reviewed with fresh eyes trained to recognize educational neglect. Emma's declining grades, Jake's behavioral changes, both children's frequent tardiness and absences. These were red flags that painted a picture of students whose home environment wasn't supporting their academic success. The children's school performance has deteriorated significantly since the beginning of the academic year, Ms. Santos noted. Teachers report anxiety, fatigue, and social withdrawal that correlate with family instability rather than learning disabilities or behavioral disorders. The preliminary CPS report concluded that while Emma and Jake weren't in immediate physical danger, their emotional and developmental needs weren't being adequately met in their current living situation. The recommendation was for increased monitoring, mandatory parenting classes for Rachel, consideration of alternative custody arrangements that better served the children's best interests. For the first time since filing my custody modification, I felt like someone with real authority was finally seeing what I'd been desperately trying to prove, that my children needed protection, not just different weekend activities. The character reference letters arrived like reinforcements in a battle I'd been fighting alone for too long. 23 people had taken time to write detailed testimonials about my character, my relationship with Emma and Jake, and my fitness. As a primary parent, each letter represented someone who'd watched me struggle, grow, and fight for my children over the past 2 years. Tony Ramirez, my foreman, had written the kind of letter that carried weight beyond its words. I've supervised Marcus Thompson for 6 years, and I've never worked with someone more dependable or dedicated to his family. When his kids need him, he moves mountains to be there. The crew respects him because he leads by example, hard work, integrity, and putting family first. The construction crew had contributed letters that painted a picture of a father who talked about his children constantly, who practiced bedtime stories during lunch breaks, who showed up to work early so he could leave on time for school events. These were working men who understood sacrifice, responsibility, and what it meant to provide for family. Mrs. Chen's letter was particularly powerful because of her neutral position as a neighbor who'd observed our family dynamics without bias. I've watched Mr. Thompson with his children for 2 years, and I've never seen anything but patience, love, and genuine concern for their well-being. He's the kind of father who remembers that Emma doesn't like loud noises and that Jake needs extra time to process instructions. Dr. Martinez had written from her perspective as the children's pediatrician, carefully worded to avoid ethical violations while still advocating for Emma and Jake's medical needs. Mr. Thompson demonstrates exceptional awareness of his children's health concerns and consistently follows through on medical recommendations. His questions show genuine understanding of childhood development and parent responsibilities. Emma's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had contributed observations about my involvement in Emma's education despite the limited custody schedule. Mr. Thompson attends every parent conference, volunteers for classroom activities when his work schedule allows, and demonstrates intimate knowledge of Emma's academic strengths and challenges. He's clearly invested in her educational success. The school secretary, Mrs. Patterson, had written about my reliability and professionalism during the countless school events I'd attended. In 20 years of working with divorced parents, I've rarely seen a father work so hard to stay connected to his children's daily lives despite limited legal access, but perhaps the most moving letter came from my own father, a man who'd never spoken publicly about emotional topics but who'd watched his son fight for his grandchildren with quiet pride. Marcus learned to be a father by watching how I tried to raise him with love, consistency, and the understanding that children need protection more than perfection. Emma and Jake are lucky to have him fighting for them. The letters created a comprehensive portrait of a man who'd been consistently underestimated by a legal system that valued credentials over character. My lack of college education became irrelevant next to testimonials about my reliability, emotional intelligence, and dedication to my children's well-being. Jake's soccer coach had written about my attendance at every game, my encouragement of other children on the team, and my appropriate behavior during competitive moments. Mr. Thompson models the kind of sportsmanship and supportive parenting we hope to see from all our parents. Jake lights up when his dad arrives at practice. The daycare director from Emma's preschool years had kept meticulous records and remembered my involvement even during my marriage to Rachel. Mr. Thompson was always the parent who asked detailed questions about Emma's development, who volunteered for field trips despite his work schedule, and who showed genuine interest in our educational philosophy. My neighbor across the hall, an elderly woman who often heard Emma and Jake during our weekend visits, had written about the sounds of a happy household. I hear laughter, bedtime stories, and the normal sounds of children who feel secure and loved. Never arguing, never crying, just the peaceful noise of family life. The pastor from the church I'd started attending after the divorce had observed my struggles with judgment and grace. Marcus came to us, broken by his divorce, but determined to become the father his children deserved. I've watched him grow in faith, character, and parenting skills over the past 2 years. Even my ex, Rachel's own mother, had quietly contributed a letter that stunned everyone involved in the case. I love my daughter, but I've become increasingly concerned about her priorities and lifestyle choices. Marcus has always been a devoted father, and Emma and Jake clearly need more stability than they're currently receiving. The letter from Rachel's mother was a bombshell that revealed cracks in Rachel's family support system. Mrs. Morrison had apparently watched her daughter's parenting deteriorate, while her ex-son-in-law fought desperately for access to his children. Her testimony carried enormous weight because of her obvious conflict of interest. She was supporting her former son-in-law over her own daughter. The collective impact of 23 character references created an undeniable portrait of a father who'd been misjudged by a system that equated education with parenting ability. These weren't form letters or casual endorsements. They were detailed testimonials from people who'd observed my relationship with Emma and Jake over years, not months. David Hensley had organized the letters strategically, grouping them by relationship type and highlighting themes that supported our custody arguments. Character witnesses won't win a custody case alone, he explained, but they provide context for everything else we've documented. They show that your concerns about the children come from love, not vindictiveness. The letters also served another crucial purpose. They demonstrated the support system Emma and Jake would have if they lived with me primarily. These weren't just people willing to write testimonials. They were neighbors, co-workers, teachers, and family members who would help me raise my children with the kind of community involvement that creates secure, well-adjusted kids. Reading through the stack of letters, I felt overwhelmed by the realization that I hadn't been fighting alone. People had been watching, caring, and hoping for Emma and Jake's well-being, even when I felt isolated by the legal system's assumptions about weekend fathers and primary mothers. The character references wouldn't prove Rachel's neglect or Steve's inappropriate influence, but they would establish that my love for Emma and Jake was supported by a community of people who believed in my fitness as their primary parent. In a custody battle that had been framed around my inadequacies, the letters shifted the narrative toward my strengths and the village of support waiting to help me raise my children. The courtroom felt like a theater where someone else's drama was about to unfold, not the place where my children's future would be decided. Judge Catherine Morrison, no relation to Rachel, despite the shared surname, presided with the kind of judicial authority that commanded respect from everyone present. Her reputation for thorough case review and child-focused decisions was exactly what Emma and Jake needed. Rachel sat at the plaintiff's table with her attorney, perfectly dressed, in a navy suit that projected competence and maternal responsibility. She'd styled her hair in a conservative bun and wore minimal makeup, the image of a devoted mother defending her children from an unstable ex-husband. Her confident posture suggested someone who expected vindication rather than challenge. David Hensley had prepared me for this moment, but the reality of formal proceedings felt surreal. 2 years of documentation, months of evidence gathering, weeks of professional evaluations, everything condensed into testimony that would determine whether I remained a weekend father or became the primary parent Emma and Jake desperately needed. Your Honor, Rachel's attorney began, Ms. Morrison has provided stable, consistent care for Emma and Jake Thompson for 3 years. She's been the primary caregiver throughout their lives, managing their education, health care, and emotional development. Mr. Thompson's recent allegations represent a desperate attempt to disrupt a custody arrangement that has served the children's best interests. The opening statement painted me as the disruptive force in an otherwise stable situation. Rachel's attorney highlighted my work schedule, my modest income, my lack of higher education, all framed as obstacles to effective parenting rather than evidence of my dedication to providing for my family. Mr. Thompson works 60 hours per week in construction, a demanding job that leaves little time for the daily responsibilities of primary custody. Ms. Morrison has structured her life around the children's needs, providing the kind of consistent availability that growing children require. When my turn came to present opening arguments, David Hensley focused on the evidence rather than attacking Rachel's character. Your Honor, this case isn't about parental convenience or lifestyle preferences. It's about 2 children whose basic needs aren't being met in their current living situation. The evidence will show a pattern of medical neglect, educational instability, and emotional trauma that demands immediate intervention. The first witness called was Dr. Martinez, whose medical testimony established the foundation of our case. Her professional demeanor and detailed records created immediate credibility as she outlined the pattern of missed appointments, ignored recommendations, and delayed treatment that characterized Rachel's approach to the children's health care. Jake Thompson has suffered from chronic respiratory issues for 8 months, Dr. Martinez testified. I've made repeated recommendations for specialist consultation, but these appointments have been canceled or rescheduled multiple times. This delay in treatment is not in the child's best interest. Rachel's attorney attempted to minimize the medical concerns, suggesting that busy parents sometimes struggle with scheduling and that missing appointments didn't constitute neglect. But Dr. Martinez's clinical experience carried weight that undermined those excuses. In 20 years of pediatric practice, I've learned to distinguish between scheduling challenges and parental disengagement, she replied. The pattern I've observed with these children suggests the latter rather than the former. Mrs. Rodriguez, Emma's teacher, provided testimony about the decline in Emma's academic performance and emotional well-being. Her observations as an education professional added another layer of evidence about the children's deteriorating situation. Emma has changed significantly this school year, Mrs. Rodriguez testified. She's become withdrawn, anxious, and frequently falls asleep during class. Her homework completion has declined, and she often appears unkempt or tired. These are warning signs that we take seriously in educational settings. The social worker, Maria Santos, delivered perhaps the most damaging testimony about the children's living conditions and emotional state. Her professional assessment carried the authority of state child protection services and provided official validation for all my concerns. My investigation revealed children who are managing adult responsibilities inappropriately for their ages. Ms. Santos testified. Emma, at 8 years old, has taken on caretaking roles for her younger brother. Jake shows signs of chronic anxiety and fear that correlate with household instability. Rachel's attorney challenged the CPS findings, arguing that the investigation was prompted by my accusations rather than independent concerns. But Ms. Santos held firm under cross-examination. CPS investigations are triggered by multiple sources of concern, not individual complaints. She clarified, the patterns we documented, educational neglect, medical neglect, emotional stress, were corroborated by school personnel, medical providers, and direct observation. Mrs. Chen's testimony provided the neutral perspective that often carries enormous weight in family court. As a disinterested neighbor with no motivation to favor either parent, her observations about the children's behavior and home environment were particularly credible. I've watched these children for 2 years, she testified with quiet dignity. They've changed from happy, outgoing kids to anxious ones who seem afraid of making noise or being noticed. That's not normal childhood development. The most dramatic moment came when Rachel took the stand in her own defense. Under direct examination from her attorney, she presented the image of a devoted mother, overwhelmed by false accusations from a vindictive ex. I've dedicated my life to Emma and Jake's well-being, she testified, her voice carrying just the right note of maternal anguish. Marcus has become obsessed with undermining my parenting because he can't accept our divorce. These allegations are his way of punishing me for moving on with my life. But David Hensley's cross-examination revealed the cracks in Rachel's carefully constructed narrative. Armed with medical records, school documentation, and CPS findings, he dismantled her claims of devoted motherhood. Ms. Morrison, can you explain why Jake's respiratory condition has gone untreated for 8 months, despite multiple doctor recommendations? I've been trying to schedule the appointment, but the specialist's office is difficult to reach. According to Dr. Martinez's records, you've canceled 3 confirmed appointments. Can you explain those cancellations? Rachel's composure began to fracture under the weight of documented evidence that contradicted her testimony. Her explanations became defensive, her answers evasive, and her maternal concern appeared increasingly performative rather than genuine. The questioning about Steve's role in the household was particularly damaging. Rachel had minimized his presence in her direct testimony, but Hensley had documentation proving otherwise. Ms. Morrison, school records show that Steve Williams has been listed as an emergency contact for the children. Is that accurate? He's been helpful with transportation occasionally, and he's present in the home several nights per week. Sometimes, but he doesn't interfere with my parenting. Yet according to the children's statements to the social worker, they're required to stay in their rooms when Mr. Williams visits. Is that your parenting choice, or his preference? Each question revealed another contradiction between Rachel's public image and the reality of her household management. The devoted mother persona couldn't withstand scrutiny when confronted with evidence of her actual parenting practices. The testimony phase concluded with my own statement to the court. After months of being portrayed as an inadequate weekend father, I finally had the opportunity to speak directly about my love for Emma and Jake and my commitment to their well-being. Your Honor, I'm not asking for custody because I want to punish Rachel or because I think I'm perfect, I testified. I'm asking because my children are suffering in their current situation, and they deserve better. They deserve a parent who puts their needs first, who doesn't make them compete with adult relationships for attention, who understands that being a father is a privilege that requires sacrifice. The courtroom fell silent as I concluded my testimony. The weight of evidence and emotion hanging in the air, Judge Morrison's expression remained neutral, but I could sense that the case had reached its turning point. The truth about Emma and Jake's lives had finally been presented in full, and now their future rested in the hands of justice. The moment Rachel's careful composure cracked was the moment the entire courtroom understood what Emma and Jake had been living with for months. It happened during David Hensley's cross-examination, when he produced phone records that contradicted her testimony about being available for the children's needs. Ms. Morrison, you testified that you're always accessible when the children's, school, or healthcare providers need to reach you, Hensley said, consulting his notes with deliberate precision. But according to Riverside Elementary's contact log, they were unable to reach you for 4 hours when Jake suffered a playground injury that required medical evaluation. Rachel's confident demeanor flickered for just a moment before she recovered. I may have been in a meeting that day. Working parents sometimes can't answer immediately, according to your testimony. You don't work outside the home. What kind of meeting lasted for hours while your 6-year-old son sat in the nurse's office with a potential concussion? The question hung in the air like an indictment. Rachel's face flushed as she realized her lie had been exposed in front of the judge, the court reporter, and everyone present. Her careful narrative about devoted motherhood was unraveling in real time. I meant I was busy with household responsibilities, Ms. Morrison. The phone records show 17 calls to various numbers listed on Jake's emergency contact form. Where exactly were you that afternoon? That 17 attempts to reach you were unsuccessful. David Hensley's voice remained professionally neutral, but the implications were devastating. Rachel had been unreachable while her injured child needed her, despite claiming that her availability was superior to my work-constrained schedule. I don't remember every detail of that specific day, Rachel said, her voice growing defensive. Parents can't be perfect all the time. This isn't about perfection, Miss Morrison. This is about a pattern of unavailability that contradicts your testimony about prioritizing the children's needs. Judge Morrison leaned forward slightly, her attention focused on Rachel's increasingly evasive answers. The carefully constructed image of maternal devotion was crumbling under scrutiny, revealing someone more concerned with maintaining her narrative than addressing her children's actual needs. The questioning turned to Steve's role in the household, an area where Rachel's testimony had been deliberately vague. Hensley produced witness statements and documentation that painted a very different picture than the minimal involvement Rachel had described. Ms. Morrison, you testified that Steve Williams is occasionally present in your home but doesn't influence your parenting decisions. Is that accurate? Yes, he's supportive but doesn't interfere. According to statements from the children's social worker, Emma reported that she and Jake are required to stay in their rooms when Mr. Williams visits. Who made that rule? Rachel's hesitation was telling children sometimes need quiet time. The specific rule about staying in rooms during Mr. Williams's visits who established that requirement. It's not a rule, it's just easier when adults need to have conversations, Ms. Morrison. Jake told the social worker that Mr. Williams doesn't like it when kids are loud. Are those Jake's words or Mr. Williams's words? Each question revealed another layer of the household dynamic that Rachel had tried to hide. The children weren't just living with their mother's boyfriend, they were accommodating his preferences, adjusting their behavior to suit his comfort, becoming invisible in their own home. Your Honor, Rachel's attorney interjected, this line of questioning seems designed to embarrass my client rather than establish relevant facts. Overruled. Judge Morrison replied. The children's living environment and the adults who influence it are directly relevant to custody determination. Hensley continued his methodical demolition of Rachel's credibility. Ms. Morrison, you testified that the children's declining academic performance is due to adjustment issues from the divorce. But the timeline shows their struggles began this fall, nearly 3 years after your separation. How do you explain that correlation? Children process things differently, or could it be related to changes in their home environment this fall? When did Mr. Williams begin staying overnight regularly? The connection was clear to everyone in the courtroom. Emma and Jake's problems had coincided with Steve's increased presence in their lives, not with the divorce that had occurred years earlier. Rachel's attempt to blame their struggles on the custody situation was exposed as deflection from Mortgage's recent domestic changes. But the most damaging moment came when Hensley presented Jake's drawing, the artwork that had first prompted his teacher's concern. The courtroom fell silent as the child's crayon documentation of fear and chaos was entered into evidence. Ms. Morrison, this is your son's representation of his family and home environment. The figure labeled Jake is hiding in a corner while larger figures dominate the center space. How do you interpret your child's artistic expression? Rachel stared at the drawing, as if seeing it for the first time, her face pale with the realization that her 6-year-old had documented the dysfunction she'd tried so hard to hide. Children's artwork doesn't always reflect reality, she said weakly. Jake has an active imagination. Are you suggesting that your child's teacher and the school counselor were wrong to be concerned about this drawing? I'm saying that one picture shouldn't be used to judge an entire household. This isn't one picture, Ms. Morrison. This is documentation of a pattern that includes medical neglect, educational decline, and emotional trauma. Can you explain how these issues serve your children's best interests? Rachel's composure finally shattered completely. You don't understand what it's like being a single mother, she burst out, her voice cracking with frustration and desperation. I'm doing the best I can with 2 kids and no support. Marcus abandoned us for his job and now he wants to swoop in and play hero. The outburst revealed the anger and resentment that Rachel had been hiding beneath her maternal martyrdom. Judge Morrison's expression remained neutral, but the mask had fallen away from Rachel's carefully constructed image. Ms. Morrison, Hensley said quietly, your ex-husband has been fighting for more time with his children for 3 years? How is that abandonment? He could have fought harder if he really cared, like he's doing now. The question hung in the air as Rachel realized she'd contradicted her own narrative. If I didn't care enough to fight for the children, why was she trying so hard to stop me from getting them? I need a recess, Rachel whispered to her attorney. But Judge Morrison had heard enough. Ms. Morrison, the judge said firmly, you'll have an opportunity to redirect with your attorney, but Mr. Hensley's cross-examination will continue until completed. The final questions focused on Rachel's priorities and decision-making, establishing a pattern that put her adult relationships ahead of her children's needs. By the time Hensley finished, Rachel's credibility as the superior parent had been systematically destroyed by her own contradictions and evasions. The truth about Emma and Jake's lives, the fear, the neglect, the emotional chaos had finally been revealed in its full scope. Rachel's breakdown on the witness stand had accomplished what months of evidence gathering couldn't. It had shown the judge exactly who was really fighting for the children's best interests. Judge Morrison's handwritten notes had been accumulating throughout the proceedings, her careful script documenting observations that would shape the most important decision of Emma and Jake's young lives. As she reviewed her notes before delivering the custody ruling, the courtroom held its collective breath. I've presided over family court for 15 years, Judge Morrison began, her voice carrying the weight of experience and authority. In that time, I've learned that the best custody decisions aren't based on parental wants or legal technicalities, but on a simple question: what arrangement will best serve these specific children's needs at this specific time? She looked directly at both Rachel and me, ensuring her words carried equal weight for all parties involved. This case presents a clear example of how circumstances can change dramatically after initial custody determinations, requiring courts to reassess what truly serves children's best interests. The judge's preliminary observations focused on the evidence rather than personalities, establishing the factual foundation for her decision. The court has reviewed extensive documentation, including medical records, school reports, social services investigations, psychological evaluations, and testimony from multiple professionals who interact with Emma and Jake Thompson regularly. Judge Morrison's tone remained measured as she addressed the central issues. The evidence reveals concerning patterns that cannot be dismissed as normal childhood adjustment or parental imperfection. We're dealing with documented medical neglect, educational decline, and emotional distress that correlates directly with changes in the children's living environment. She referenced specific testimony that had been particularly influential. Dr. Martinez's medical records show 8 months of delayed treatment for Jake's respiratory condition, despite repeated recommendations for specialist care. This isn't scheduling difficulty, this is a failure to prioritize a child's health needs. The judge's attention turned to the social services findings. Ms. Santos's investigation revealed children who are managing adult responsibilities inappropriate for their developmental stage. 8-year-old Emma has assumed caretaking roles for her younger brother, while 6-year-old Jake exhibits chronic anxiety about his living situation. Judge Morrison paused to consult her notes before continuing. The children's own expressions through artwork, conversations with school personnel, and statements to social services paint a consistent picture of household instability and emotional stress that demands immediate intervention. She addressed Rachel directly, her voice firm but not unkind. Ms. Morrison, your love for your children isn't in question, but love alone doesn't constitute adequate parenting when children's basic needs aren't being met. The evidence shows a pattern of prioritizing adult relationships over parental responsibilities. The judge's criticism was specific and damning. Your testimony revealed inconsistencies about your availability for the children, defensive responses to legitimate concerns about their welfare, and a troubling inability to recognize the impact of household dynamics on their emotional well-being. Then Judge Morrison turned to address my fitness as a primary parent. Mr. Thompson, you've demonstrated significant growth in your understanding of parental responsibilities since the original custody determination. Your documentation of concerns shows genuine advocacy rather than vindictive harassment. She acknowledged the practical challenges I'd face. Your work schedule and modest income present real obstacles to primary custody, but the evidence shows you've developed realistic plans for childcare, education, support, and medical management that prioritize the children's needs over convenience. The judge's voice carried conviction as she reached the heart of her decision. The psychological evaluation, character references, and professional testimony established that Mr. Thompson can provide the stability, attention, and advocacy these children require. More importantly, Emma and Jake have expressed clear preferences for increased time with their father. Judge Morrison's handwritten notes captured the weight of the moment as she prepared to announce the custody modification. The court finds that a material change in circumstances has occurred that substantially affects the children's welfare. The current custody arrangement no longer serves Emma and Jake's best interests. She looked directly at Rachel, whose face had gone pale with the realization of what was coming. Ms. Morrison, your custodial rights are hereby modified. Primary physical custody of Emma and Jake Thompson is awarded to their father, Marcus Thompson, effective immediately. The words hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. Rachel's gasp of shock was audible, her attorney's hand reaching out to steady her as the reality of losing her children sank in. Mr. Thompson will have primary physical custody with decision-making authority for education, healthcare, and daily welfare matters. Judge Morrison continued. Ms. Morrison will have supervised visitation rights, pending completion of court-ordered parenting classes and psychological evaluation. The judge's reasoning was thorough and compassionate. This decision isn't punitive toward Ms. Morrison, but protective of children whose needs haven't been adequately met. The court's primary obligation is to Emma and Jake's welfare, not parental preferences or convenience. She addressed the transition period with careful attention to the children's emotional needs. Custody transfer will occur within 7 hours with support from social services to ensure minimal trauma. Both children will receive counseling support during this adjustment period. Judge Morrison concluded with words that would echo in my memory forever. The court recognizes that Mr. Thompson has fought tirelessly for his children's well-being. Despite facing legal and financial obstacles, his persistence and advocacy demonstrate the kind of parental commitment that serves children's best interests. As the gavel fell, officially changing Emma and Jake's lives forever, I felt overwhelming gratitude mixed with the enormous responsibility of primary parenthood. The weekend dad who had been dismissed as inadequate had become the primary parent his children needed and deserved. Rachel's breakdown was immediate and devastating, but Judge Morrison's decision was final. The court had spoken, and my children were finally coming home. The school enrollment forms spread across my kitchen table represented everything I'd fought for and everything I now had to prove I could handle. Emma needed to be registered at the elementary school 3 blocks from my apartment. Jake required enrollment in the district's kindergarten program, and both children needed documentation of immunizations, medical histories, and emergency contacts that would establish their new life with me as their primary parent. The first morning as a full-time father began at 5:30 a.m., not because of construction work, but because Emma woke up crying from a nightmare about being sent back to Rachel's house. I sat on her bed in the pale, pre-dawn light, stroking her hair and promising that she was safe, that this was permanent, that no judge would send her away from a father who'd fought so hard to protect her. "Dad, what if we were too much trouble?" she whispered, her 8-year-old mind still processing the enormity of the custody change. "What if you decide you don't want to take care of us every day?" Her fear broke my heart because it revealed how deeply the instability had affected her. Emma had learned to expect disappointment, to prepare for adults who found children inconvenient, to guard her heart against hoping for too much. "Princess, there's nothing you or Jake could do that would make me not want you," I promised, holding her until her breathing settled back into sleep. "This is your home now, forever." Jake's adjustment was different but equally challenging. My 6-year-old son had stopped wetting the bed the moment he moved into my apartment, as if his body had finally relaxed enough to trust sleep. But he followed me everywhere, shadowing my movements like he was afraid I might disappear if he looked away. "Can I help make breakfast?" he asked every morning, standing beside me at the stove with the earnest desire to be useful that children develop when they've learned that being helpful might mean being wanted. "You can always help, buddy," I told him, lifting him onto a chair so he could scramble eggs while I made toast. "But you don't have to earn your place here. You belong here, because you're my son." The practical challenges of single parenthood hit immediately. My work schedule required complete restructuring. No more 60-hour weeks, no more weekend overtime, no more putting work ahead of school plays and doctor appointments. Tony Ramirez had been understanding about the changes, adjusting my responsibilities to accommodate school pickup times and sick days. "Family comes first," he'd said when I'd explained the new custody arrangement. "We'll make it work." The apartment needed significant changes to accommodate 2 children full-time. Emma's room required a proper desk for homework, while Jake's room needed childproofing for his tendency to climb on furniture. The single bathroom became a scheduling challenge that required morning routines choreographed with military precision. But the most important changes were emotional rather than practical. Both children needed to unlearn the careful behavior they'd developed to survive in Rachel's chaotic household. Emma had to be taught that expressing needs wasn't selfish, that asking for help with homework wouldn't result in impatient sighs or dismissive responses. "I don't understand this math problem," she admitted one evening, her voice tentative as if expecting frustration. "Then let's figure it out together," I said, pulling up a chair beside her at the kitchen table. "Math is supposed to be how you learn." Jake had to relearn what normal childhood looked like. He'd become so accustomed to staying quiet and invisible that he needed permission to be loud, to run through the apartment, to take up space without apologizing for his presence. "Can I play with my trucks in the living room?" he'd ask, as if toy placement required adult approval. "Jake, this is your home. You can play wherever you want, as long as you clean up afterward." The school transition revealed how much the children's previous environment had affected their academic and social development. Emma's teacher at her new school, Ms. Patricia Williams, noticed immediately that Emma was behind grade level in reading, and showed signs of chronic stress that had interfered with learning. "She's clearly intelligent," Ms. Williams assured me during our first parent conference, "but she needs time to catch up and confidence to participate. I suspect she's been managing too many adult concerns to focus properly on childhood development." Jake's kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Sandra Lopez, observed similar patterns. "He's socially immature in some ways, but emotionally mature in others. Classic signs of a child who's experienced instability. With consistent structure and encouragement, he should thrive academically." Both teachers were aware of the custody change and the children's background, approaching Emma and Jake with the kind of understanding that helped them feel safe enough to start learning again. The difference in their behavior at the new school was remarkable. Emma began raising her hand in class. Jake started making friends at recess. The medical appointments I'd been fighting for finally happened. Jake's persistent cough was diagnosed as exercise-induced asthma, easily managed with an inhaler that should have been prescribed months earlier. Emma's hearing evaluation revealed mild loss that required monitoring but no immediate intervention. These children should have received this care much sooner. Dr. Roberts, their new pediatrician, noted in his chart, the delays in treatment were medically unnecessary and potentially harmful. The evening routines we developed became anchors of stability in their new life. Dinner at the kitchen table with conversations about their school days, homework completed with patient assistance, baths that didn't rush them through basic hygiene, and bedtime stories that lasted as long as they needed to feel secure. "Dad, will you still read to us when we're older?" Jake asked one night, his head heavy against my shoulder as I finished his favorite book about brave knights and rescued dragons. "I'll read to you until you're old enough to read to your own kids," I promised, understanding that these moments were healing years of uncertainty and fear. The supervised visits with Rachel were difficult for everyone involved. The social worker who monitored their interactions noted that both children were polite but distant, careful not to reveal too much about their happiness and their new home. Rachel's attempts to restore their previous relationship felt forced and desperate. "Do you miss living with Mommy?" she'd ask during visits, as if their answer might change the court's decision. Emma and Jake would exchange glances, the kind of silent communication that siblings develop when they need to protect themselves from adult emotions before giving non-committal responses that didn't hurt anyone's feelings, but didn't betray their relief at being safe. The transformation in both children over their first month of stable living was remarkable. Emma's grades improved dramatically, Jake's nightmares stopped entirely, and both kids began exhibiting the kind of confident childhood behavior that comes from knowing you're truly wanted and protected. They were finally home. The family photo sits on my nightstand now, a simple snapshot that captures everything I fought for and everything we've become. Emma and Jake are laughing at something just outside the camera's frame, their faces bright with the kind of uninhibited joy that only comes from children who feel completely secure in their father's love. It was taken 6 months after the custody decision, on Jake's 7th birthday. In the backyard of the small house we'd moved into together. I look different. In that photo too, the worried, defeated expression I'd worn for 3 years has been replaced by something I barely recognize. Not the false bravado I'd tried to project during the custody battle, but the quiet assurance of a father who finally understands his own worth and his children's needs. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Those first months of primary custody were the hardest thing I'd ever done, harder than any construction project or legal battle. Learning to manage 2 children's complete lives, their education, healthcare, emotional needs, social development, and daily happiness while maintaining my own career and sanity, required skills I hadn't known I possessed. But children are remarkably resilient when they feel truly safe. Emma's academic performance didn't just improve, it soared. Her new teacher, Ms. Williams, called me in November to discuss accelerated reading programs because Emma was testing above grade level. She's making up for lost time, Ms. Williams explained. Children who've been stressed often show rapid improvement once their environment stabilizes. Jake's transformation was even more dramatic. The anxious, clingy 6-year-old who had shadowed my every movement became an outgoing 7-year-old who invited friends over for sleepovers and joined the school soccer team. His asthma, properly managed with medication and monitoring, rarely interfered with his activities. "Dad, can Tommy sleep over on Friday?" became a regular question, and hosting other children showed me how normal Emma and Jake had become. Their friends' parents commented on how polite, helpful, and happy my children seemed, observations that reminded me how different they'd been just months earlier. The small house we'd moved into wasn't much larger than my apartment, but it had a yard where the kids could be loud and a separate room for homework that didn't compete with kitchen activities. More importantly, it felt permanent in a way the apartment never had. Emma decorated her room with artwork from school. Jake organized his toys in bins that stayed organized, and both children began planning next year's Halloween costumes. And February, Rachel's supervised visits gradually became unsupervised as she completed court-ordered parenting classes and demonstrated emotional stability. The children's relationship with their mother would never return to what it had been, but it evolved into something healthier: regular visits without overnight stays, phone calls that both kids enjoyed, and holiday arrangements that worked for everyone. "Mom's different now," Emma observed after one visit. "She listens better and doesn't get mad when we tell her about school." The court-mandated counseling had apparently helped Rachel understand how her priorities had affected Emma and Jake. She'd ended her relationship with Steve, moved to a smaller apartment she could afford without my child support, and begun focusing on rebuilding trust with our children rather than defending her past decisions. My relationship with Rachel would never be easy, but it became functional. We could discuss the children's needs without litigation, coordinate schedules without drama, and make joint decisions about their welfare without animosity. Not friendship, but the kind of respectful co-parenting that serves children better than ongoing conflict. The legal bills from the custody battle took 2 years to pay off, requiring sacrifices that sometimes meant generic groceries and second-hand clothes. But Emma and Jake never went without necessities, and more importantly, they never doubted that their father would provide whatever they needed, even if it meant working extra hours or skipping purchases for himself. Tony Ramirez promoted me to project supervisor, a role that came with better pay and more reasonable hours. "You've earned it," he said when offering the position. Management skills learned from single parenting transfer well to construction supervision. The promotion allowed us to take small vacations, camping trips where Jake could be as loud as he wanted and Emma could read by the campfire without interruption. Beach weekends where both children built sandcastles without worrying about cleanup time. Simple pleasures that became precious because we'd all learned not to take stability for granted. Mrs. Chen remained our neighbor and surrogate grandmother, the woman who'd first validated my concerns about the children's welfare. She babysat during my rare evening meetings, taught Emma to knit, and showed Jake how to grow tomatoes in containers on our back porch. "I knew you'd be a good father if given the chance," she told me one evening as we watched the children play in the yard. "Some people are born to nurture, and others learn through necessity. You learned." The custody evaluator, Dr. Walsh, checked in periodically during the first year to ensure the transition was successful. Her follow-up reports documented children who were thriving academically, socially, and emotionally under their father's primary care. "This case represents exactly why family courts must remain flexible about custody arrangements," she noted in her final report. "Children's needs change, parents grow and develop, and what serves a family best at one point may not serve them best later." Emma and Jake still have moments when they remember their previous life nightmares occasionally. Anxiety about unexpected schedule changes, careful behaviors that remind me how much healing they've done. But these episodes become rarer and shorter, replaced by the normal concerns of childhood, friendship drama, homework challenges, and whether they'll make the soccer team. "Dad, do you think we'll ever have to go back to Mom's house to live?" Jake asked one evening, the question prompted by a friend whose parents were divorcing. "Never," I told him, pulling both children close on the couch where we read together every night. This is your home. I'm your primary parent, and that's not going to change. The certainty in my voice came from hard-won experience. I'd learned to trust my parental instincts, to advocate fiercely for my children's needs, and to understand that being a good father wasn't about perfection, it was about showing up consistently with love, patience, and unwavering commitment to their well-being. Rachel had been wrong about my ability to handle the children alone. What she'd seen as inadequacy was actually inexperience, and what she'd dismissed as impossibility was just a father who needed the chance to prove himself. The weekend dad who doubted his own abilities had become the primary parent his children needed, not through court orders or legal victories, but through the daily choice to put Emma and Jake's needs above everything else. Looking at that family photo now, I see three people who fought their way to happiness and safety together. The construction foreman, who never thought he'd be arguing in courtrooms, became a father who would walk through fire for his children's well-being. Emma and Jake didn't just get a different custody arrangement, they got the childhood they deserved. With a father who finally understood that love isn't measured in weekend visits, but in the thousand small moments that build a life together, we built something beautiful from the wreckage of our original family, and every day we choose to keep building it stronger.